You keep asking why God doesn't answer you. You pray, you beg, you whisper your pain into the night, and all you hear is silence. It terrifies you, because deep down, silence feels like rejection. It feels like absence, like being forgotten. But what if the silence isn't his absence at all? What if it's his presence in its purest form? What if the quiet you run from is the voice you've been trying to hear all your life? We live in a world addicted to noise. Every moment is filled with something: music, screens, words, thoughts, endless motion. The mind has become a marketplace where every emotion, every fear, every regret is shouting for attention. And in that chaos, we keep asking for God's voice. We demand a sign, a miracle, a sound that cuts through it all. But how can you hear the eternal whisper when you can't even sit still for 1 minute without reaching for distraction? Rumi said, "The soul is like a reed. When it's empty, it sings. When it's full, it only breaks." You keep wondering why you feel broken. Maybe it's because your soul is too full of noise to sing. You've confused fullness with life and silence with death. But silence is not the end of life. Silence is where life begins. Every heartbeat, every sunrise, every breath that enters your lungs was born from silence first. We think of God as a thunderclap, a voice that shakes the earth. But Rumi taught something far quieter. God's voice, he said, is softer than breath, smaller than a thought. You won't find it in the roar of your own mind, but in the space between one thought and the next, in the stillness beneath the storm. That is where the sacred hides, not in the noise, but in the pause you keep avoiding. But you don't trust silence. You think if God truly loved you, he would speak in words you could hear. You wait for a sign, and when none comes, you fill the gap with your own fears. You tell yourself he's gone, or that you're not worthy, or that you prayed wrong. You forget that sometimes love doesn't speak. It just stays. The sun doesn't shout that it's shining. It simply fills the world with light. God doesn't need to announce himself. His silence is already enough. There is a reason Rumi walked through deserts and fell quiet for years. He wasn't lost. He was listening. He was learning that the divine doesn't need a voice to be heard. When you finally stop speaking, when you finally stop trying to control what the answer should sound like, the truth begins to rise like air from the bottom of a still lake. You begin to hear the sound of your own soul, and that sound has always been God speaking back. Maybe silence isn't the problem. Maybe it's the cure. Maybe God's not withholding words. Maybe he's trying to teach you a new kind of hearing, one that doesn't come from your ears, but from the quiet inside your chest. The noise of your thoughts drowns him out. The silence reveals him. So next time you pray and hear nothing, don't panic. Don't rush to fill the space. Don't assume he's gone. Sit in the stillness and feel the pulse of your own heart. That rhythm, steady, alive, eternal. That is his reply. You've been hearing him all along. You just didn't recognize the sound. Rumi said, "Silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation." And maybe tonight, you'll finally stop asking for a louder voice and start learning to listen to the quiet one that's been speaking through everything, even your own breath. There comes a moment when silence no longer feels peaceful. It feels cruel. You've prayed, waited, begged, and all you hear is nothing. No sign, no answer, no movement. Just the sound of your own breathing in a room that feels too small for your pain. You start to wonder if your words even reach beyond the ceiling. Maybe they die somewhere in the air. Maybe no one's listening at all. That's where most people break, because we were taught that God speaks in miracles, in visions, in obvious signs, something undeniable, something dramatic. But what happens when there's nothing? What happens when heaven itself feels locked and you're standing outside with your heart bleeding in your hands? You start to believe you've been abandoned. That's what silence does to the impatient soul. It exposes its hunger for control. Rumi once said, "When I thought he was silent, he was listening. When I thought he had left, he was closer than my breath." But it doesn't feel that way when you're the one kneeling in the dark, whispering prayers that seem to echo back at you like ghosts. You think, if God is love, why does it hurt like this? Why must he hide when I need him the most? You look at others and think they've found peace. People who smile, who seem certain, who speak of faith as if it's easy. But you don't see the deserts they crossed to get there. You don't see the nights they spent crying in the same silence you're drowning in now. The truth is, no one reaches light without walking through the absence of it. The silence you curse is the passage everyone must cross. Silence is where your false beliefs die. The idea that you can control God. The illusion that faith means comfort. The fantasy that prayer always leads to answers. In silence, those illusions begin to fall apart one by one until you're left with nothing but raw being. And it's only there, in that stripped down emptiness, that something real begins to move. The human mind wants to trade. I pray and God responds. But love doesn't trade. Love gives without reason. It listens when it has nothing to say. And sometimes the only way for God to reach you is to remove every other sound, every other comfort, until you're forced to sit in the truth that his silence isn't rejection, it's transformation. Rumi said, "The wound is where the light enters you." You think you've been wounded by silence, but maybe the silence is the light itself. It's not that he won't speak. It's that his language isn't made of words. He speaks through delay, through absence, through the ache that refuses to leave. Because pain has a way of focusing your hearing. When everything else is gone, you start to notice the small things. The air against your skin, the rhythm of your pulse, the stillness that hums beneath everything. That's him. Always has been. So maybe the silence is not a void. Maybe it's a mirror. When you cry to heaven and hear nothing, what if heaven is simply holding up a reflection, showing you yourself, stripped of everything but need? The crying isn't useless. It's cleansing. Every tear clears the space between you and God. Every unanswered prayer teaches you to stop performing and start feeling. Rumi wrote, "Do not seek signs, seek stillness. The answer hides there." Maybe the silence is his way of teaching you to stop shouting, to stop trying to earn what has always been yours. You're not waiting for God to speak. You're learning to hear him in a different way. And maybe the hardest truth of all is this: the silence doesn't end when you stop praying. It ends when you stop expecting. When you stop demanding a voice and start trusting the presence behind the quiet. Because silence is not his absence. Silence is his arrival. There is a place between the question and the answer, between the prayer and the response. It is vast, quiet, and unbearable. Rumi called it the desert of the soul. You arrive there after the noise of pleading fades and the echo of your own voice disappears. It's the emptiness that comes after you've done everything you know how to do, and nothing changes. You wake up in the same pain, breathe the same silence, and still, no sign comes. At first, you call it punishment. You think, maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I'm unworthy. Maybe he's tired of listening. But the desert is not punishment. The desert is where faith stops being an idea and becomes real. It's the place where belief burns away everything that isn't truth, where you learn that faith without silence is just noise dressed as devotion. Every spiritual journey passes through this wasteland. The saints, the mystics, the poets, all of them walked through it. They didn't find God in comfort. They found him in waiting, in that long, dry pause where nothing moves, where time itself feels heavy. Rumi said, "Be patient where you sit in the dark. The dawn is coming." But patience doesn't mean waiting for the sky to change. It means learning to breathe while it's still black. Waiting breaks you in a way that praying never could, because in waiting, you have no control. You can't negotiate with silence. You can't force revelation. You can only surrender. And that's the point. The desert strips away everything: your ideas of God, your expectations of love, your belief that you can earn peace through effort. You're left with nothing but presence. No words, no proofs, just existence. That's where the transformation begins. Because in the absence of answers, you start to see what's always been there. The wind brushing across your skin, the warmth of sunlight through the emptiness, the rhythm of your breath that's kept you alive even when you forgot to care. You realize that silence is not the absence of God, it's the absence of everything that is not God. The desert is a teacher with no voice. It doesn't explain, it reveals. It forces you to face what you've built your life on: comfort, control, certainty. And then it takes them all away. It's brutal, it's humbling, but it's sacred. Because when everything collapses, what's left is real. You begin to see that your prayers were never about changing the world outside you. They were about changing the world within you. Rumi said, "Don't seek water, become thirsty." You thought your waiting was a failure, but the thirst it creates, that raw, aching desire for truth, is the beginning of everything holy. You cannot receive the divine if you're already full of answers. You have to be empty first. You have to stand in the heat and let it strip you down to your essence. Some days, the silence feels endless. Some nights, the waiting feels like dying. But then something small happens. Not a miracle, but a shift. You stop counting the days. You stop expecting the voice to come. You stop fighting the stillness. And in that surrender, something soft begins to move in you. It's not the answer you were waiting for. It's peace. A fragile, quiet peace that doesn't depend on outcomes. That's when you understand what Rumi meant when he said, "What you seek is seeking you." The waiting was never empty. It was the space where God was drawing near, reshaping you into someone who could recognize him when he finally arrived. The desert doesn't end when you get the answer. It ends when you no longer need one. There comes a point when you stop fighting the quiet. You stop demanding that something happen. You stop trying to decode every pause, every moment of stillness, every unanswered prayer. The silence is still there, vast, deep, endless, but it no longer feels like absence. It starts to feel alive. You begin to sense a kind of movement inside it, something you can't name but can feel. It's like the air between two heartbeats, the invisible pause between waves, the stillness before dawn. And you realize this is not emptiness at all. This is communication. Rumi said, "God speaks through the silence of your heart." You never understood that before, because you were waiting for words. You expected something dramatic, a vision, a sound, a message that would shake your world. But the divine doesn't shout. The divine breathes. It whispers through the smallest things, the rustle of leaves when there's no wind, the warmth of sunlight on your face, the sudden calm in the middle of chaos. The language of silence is not made of syllables. It is made of presence. You begin to notice how much life exists in the things that make no noise. The moon doesn't speak, yet it commands the tides. The stars don't shout, yet they guide those who wander. Even your breath, the quiet rhythm that has carried you through every storm, says more than any sermon ever could. The divine doesn't use language the way humans do. It uses being. In silence, every detail becomes sacred. The sound of your own breathing becomes a prayer. The stillness between thoughts becomes a temple. The space around you, once frightening, becomes vast and compassionate, like a hand holding you without pressure. You realize that the silence you once feared is not outside of you. It is inside you, waiting to be recognized. Rumi said, "Silence is the root of everything. If you spiral into its void, 100 voices will thunder messages you long to hear." He didn't mean literal thunder. He meant understanding, the kind that rises uninvited, wordless but certain. You begin to receive answers you never asked for, not in sentences, but in awareness. You find yourself knowing things without knowing how you know. Peace appears where panic used to live. Gratitude replaces need. This is the sacred paradox. When you stop demanding to hear, you begin to listen. And when you begin to listen, you realize you were never alone in the first place. God was not silent. He was waiting for you to become quiet enough to hear him. The language of silence is subtle. It doesn't convince, it reveals. It doesn't argue, it unfolds. It doesn't explain, it invites. It doesn't comfort in the way you expect, but it gives you something deeper than comfort: understanding. And you start to see how much of life speaks this way. The smile of a stranger, the way light shifts through a window, the pause between two notes of music. The moment you exhale and realize, for just a second, you're free from all thought. Those moments are his sentences. Those details are his verses. You begin to trust this new way of hearing. You stop measuring your faith by how much you understand and start measuring it by how open you can be. Silence becomes not a void, but a conversation, a communion without words. It's how the eternal speaks to what's eternal in you. And maybe, for the first time in your life, you realize that you don't need an answer at all, because silence has already said everything. There comes a point when you stop waiting for an answer, not because you've stopped believing, but because you finally understand what faith really means. It's not waiting for a door to open or for a voice to thunder through the clouds. It's learning to live inside the silence without demanding it to change. It's realizing that maybe the answer isn't something you receive. Maybe it's something you become. Expectation dies slowly. It clings. It whispers, "If I pray harder, he'll speak. If I'm patient enough, something will happen." You bargain, you plead, you make promises you can't keep, because the mind refuses to surrender control. You want certainty. You want proof. You want a sign that you're not forgotten. But Rumi said, when you let go of what you want, you find what you need. And what you need is not a response, it's presence. Silence teaches that love doesn't always come in the form of comfort. Sometimes, love arrives as stillness, as nothingness, as the soft refusal of the divine to meet you in your expectations. Because to meet you, there would only reinforce your illusion that you can shape God into what you want him to be. So he waits, patiently, quietly, until you stop trying to bend the infinite into human form. At first, this feels like death, because it is. It's the death of the false self, the part of you that thinks it knows what's best, the part that prays not to surrender, but to control the outcome. The silence starves that part of you. It doesn't feed your ego. It doesn't answer your conditions. It simply exists, still and unmoving, until the self that demands begins to dissolve. And when it does, something extraordinary happens. Peace begins to grow in the ashes. You begin to see that the silence is not ignoring you. It's transforming you. Every moment without an answer stretches your capacity to trust. Every day without a sign teaches you to rest in uncertainty. Every prayer that ends with nothing teaches you to listen more deeply, not with your ears, but with your soul. Rumi said, "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." Silence is the space where that becoming happens. It's where you stop grasping for meaning and start breathing it in. You no longer chase miracles. You start to recognize that every breath, every moment, every pause between heartbeats is already miraculous. You no longer need the divine to perform for you, because you've realized he's already here, not as sound, not as sign, but as stillness itself. When expectation dies, gratitude is born. You stop asking why things happen and start seeing the beauty in the way they unfold. You stop seeing silence as a void and start seeing it as an embrace, one that doesn't need to speak to be understood. Because true love doesn't always reassure. Sometimes it simply holds. You begin to thank the silence. Thank it for stripping away your need to control. Thank it for forcing you to look inward. Thank it for revealing that peace is not something you find when everything works out. It's something you discover when nothing does. The divine has no need to explain itself. It doesn't speak in ways that satisfy the mind. It speaks in ways that transform the heart. It breaks. It empties. It waits. And when the waiting has purified you, when the noise of expectation finally dissolves, you realize that silence was never God's absence. It was his love in its most sacred form. Now, when you sit in the quiet, you no longer feel forgotten. You feel held. You no longer listen for words. You listen for being. And in that stillness, you understand the truth Rumi lived for. Silence is the prayer. Silence is the answer. Silence is the presence itself. There is a quiet shift that happens after the death of expectation. It's not something you notice right away. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or sudden clarity. It comes softly, like dawn. One morning, you wake up and realize that you are no longer waiting for something to change. You are no longer begging the silence to end. You are simply sitting within it, breathing, existing, listening. And for the first time, it doesn't hurt. The stillness that once felt unbearable now feels sacred. It's not emptiness anymore. It's presence. Rumi said, "There is a voice that doesn't use words. Listen. You always thought you understood what that meant, but now you feel it. Listening is not something you do. It's something you become. It's the state of being so open that you can sense the divine pulse in everything around you. The wind no longer feels random. The sunlight feels deliberate. Even the moments that used to feel like interruptions now feel like messages. When you finally listen, you realize that God never stopped speaking. He was in every delay, every heartbreak, every unanswered prayer. He was in the pauses, the detours, the silences between your desperate questions. You were just too loud to hear him, too full of wanting, too afraid of quiet. But now, the fear is gone. What once felt like silence now feels like the hum of the universe, steady, constant, alive. It's strange. Nothing about your life has changed. The same problems exist, the same uncertainty, the same imperfections, the same questions, but now you carry them differently. They no longer weigh you down. They no longer define you. Because you've realized that peace was never about getting rid of the noise outside. It was about quieting the noise within. The storm can rage, but it can't touch you anymore. You've found something still inside yourself that doesn't move. This is what Rumi meant when he said, "The quieter you become, the more you are able to hear." You start hearing in ways you never imagined. The laughter of a child, the rustle of a tree, the sound of your own breath in the dark. They're no longer ordinary. They're alive with meaning. They're sacred syllables in a language older than words, the language of existence itself. When you finally listen, your prayers change. They stop being requests. They become gratitude. You no longer say, "Give me peace." You say, "Thank you for what is." You stop asking to be saved from the fire and instead whisper, "Teach me what the fire means." You begin to understand that every experience, every silence, every ache was not something to escape, but something to receive. And in that realization, a new kind of joy begins to rise in you. Not the joy that depends on what happens, but the joy that simply is. It's quiet, deep, and steady. It doesn't come from answers. It comes from alignment, from hearing the rhythm of the divine heartbeat and realizing you've been moving to it all along. Rumi wrote, "When I stopped searching, I found everything I was looking for. It was right here, in the stillness." You feel that now. You don't need to chase meaning anymore. You are meaning. You don't need to hear a voice to know you're loved. The silence itself is love, vast, patient, endless. When you finally listen, you realize that silence is not something to escape, but something to enter. It's a homecoming, the return of your soul to what it always knew, but forgot in the noise. You understand now that God doesn't hide behind silence. He is the silence. And when that truth sinks deep enough, when you finally stop trying to interpret it, you will feel what Rumi felt when he said, "Silence is the music of love." Because in that moment, when you are no longer trying to understand, control, or expect, you are finally listening. And in your listening, you are free. There is a light that doesn't blind, a light that doesn't arrive with thunder or fire. It doesn't come from the sky or from candles or from dreams. It rises quietly inside you, the way dawn rises without asking permission. It doesn't demand attention. It simply is. You first notice it when you stop looking for miracles, when you stop asking the silence to speak and start resting inside it. That's when something begins to move beneath your ribs. Not a sound, not a thought, but a feeling. Gentle, alive, weightless. It's as if the universe finally exhaled inside you. The ache that once filled you is now warm. The emptiness that once terrified you now glows. This is the still light Rumi wrote about. The one that doesn't shout, doesn't dazzle, doesn't burn. The one that hums quietly in the background of everything. "I looked for God in temples and stars," he said, "and found him shining in my own heart." You used to think light meant revelation, visions, divine voices, something grand. But this light doesn't come to reveal. It comes to be. It doesn't answer questions. It dissolves the need to ask them. It doesn't fix your life. It makes your life holy. The still light lives in everything. In the spaces between words, in the pauses of your breath, in the soft gaze of a stranger. You start seeing it in cracks on the walls, in reflections in puddles, in your own tired hands. The world becomes a lantern, and everything inside it burns with quiet radiance. It's strange. You thought enlightenment would be loud, spectacular, filled with glory. But when it finally comes, it feels like a whisper, a soft yes beneath every heartbeat, a deep peace that doesn't depend on anything going right. You realize this light has always been here. You just couldn't see it through the noise of your wanting. Now, when you look at others, you see it in them too, even in those lost in pain, even in those angry at life. The light doesn't vanish when we forget it. It waits. It hides behind fear, behind grief, behind noise, until one day silence clears the air and the light steps forward again. You begin to understand that this light is not something you receive, it's something you remember. It's what's left when everything false has been burned away. It's the truth beneath all truths. It's the voice beneath all voices. It's the silence beneath all silences. Rumi said, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." This light is that realization. The moment you see that God was never somewhere else, He was never outside, never distant. He was the pulse behind your sorrow, the stillness in your storms, the listener inside your silence. And when you finally feel that light, you stop needing to believe, because belief is for when you don't yet know. This isn't belief anymore. It's knowing. A knowing that doesn't need proof or words or signs. A knowing that sits inside you, quiet as dawn, unshakable as eternity. The still light doesn't ask you to change the world. It asks you to see the world differently, to notice that every shadow only exists because of it, to understand that even your pain has always been held in light, that the silence wasn't empty. It was radiant all along. And now you see why God was silent, because He wasn't trying to speak to you. He was trying to become you. You sit in this realization, breathing gently, and the silence feels golden. The world feels sacred. You close your eyes and know the light will never leave, because it never came. It was always here. Rumi whispered it centuries ago, and now you finally understand. The light you seek is the light you are. There comes a moment when even the idea of silence disappears. You no longer think of it as quiet or absence or waiting. It simply becomes the natural state of your being, vast, endless, clear. You are no longer separate from it. You are not someone inside the silence. You are the silence. And in that realization, something magnificent happens. You hear the voice that was always there. It doesn't come as words. It doesn't form sentences. It doesn't even sound like sound. It's an awareness, an inner warmth that moves through every breath, every thought, every motion. It's like a soft vibration of being, a hum that says, "I am here," even when nothing is happening. This is the voice within the silence, the voice of God that doesn't speak to you, but through you. It doesn't teach through scripture or logic or signs. It teaches through your own heartbeat, through your compassion, through the stillness that now lives behind your eyes. The silence has changed you. You no longer search for meaning. You have become the space where meaning reveals itself. Rumi said, "Listen to the silence. It has so much to say." And now you know that silence doesn't need to say anything at all, because the silence is the message. It's the living proof that God doesn't live in sound. He lives in awareness. When your mind grows still enough, when the noise finally burns away, what remains is not emptiness, but fullness. It is not death. It is the most vibrant kind of life. You understand now that all along, the silence was guiding you, not punishing, not withholding, but shaping you. Every unanswered prayer was a doorway, every delay, a redirection, every quiet night, an invitation to become vast enough to hold the divine without needing explanation. The voice within the silence doesn't tell you what to do. It simply moves through you. You start feeling its rhythm in your actions, in your words, in your presence. You find yourself forgiving without thinking about it. You find yourself helping without planning to. You find yourself smiling without reason. Because when God finally lives through you, you no longer have to ask what love is. You become its expression. You begin to notice that the world itself speaks the same silent language. The trees breathe it. The oceans hum it. The stars pulse it. Even the air around you carries it. That deep, sacred quiet that holds everything in balance. And for the first time, you realize that there was never a wall between you and God. The wall was noise. The wall was fear. The wall was you thinking you were separate. Silence burned that wall away, and what's left is union. Rumi wrote, I closed my mouth and spoke to you in 100 silent ways. You finally understand. This is prayer. Not words, not requests, but presence. You don't talk to God anymore. You live with Him. Your breath becomes the prayer. Your silence becomes His voice. Every heartbeat becomes an amen. And now, when you walk through the world, you see everything as sacred conversation. The wind against your face is a verse. The pause before laughter is scripture. The quiet between two people who understand each other is divine music. This is the end of searching. Not because you've found the answer, but because you've become one with the question. Silence is no longer an experience, it's your nature. And in that nature, you finally know what Rumi meant when he said, "Silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation." You sit quietly, breathing, and feel the pulse of eternity in your chest. You no longer need proof, no longer need words, no longer need to understand. The silence holds you. The silence is you. And as the world spins and the noise of life continues beyond you, something within stays unmoved, vast, luminous, awake. You smile softly and whisper, not with your lips, but with your being. The silence was never empty. It was always full of Him. If this silence spoke to you, share it. Let its stillness reach others. Leave a word, a thought, a reflection, not to break the silence, but to continue it. And if this journey touched you, stay. There is more light ahead.